essentially for two reasons. One would be for investors, and the second reason is for the planet. When I look back 30 years, which is when I graduated from business school, and I think about what had the greatest impact on business and therefore on investors during that period, and the answer is pretty simple, which is technology. Right? Technology has changed everything in the business world in the last 30 years, specifically digital technologies. And if you look back 30 years ago and as an investor said, what were the 10 most valuable companies back then? Well, it turns out there was one tech company of the top 10. And if you look at that same analysis today, 7 of the top 10 companies globally are the most valuable companies globally are tech companies, right? So technology has changed everything. Okay, now let's forward 30 years, because that's what matters to investors, obviously, what's going to happen in the future, and ask ourselves the same question. What will impact business and investors more than anything in the next 3 decades? And my answer is climate change. We've got 3 decades to completely rebuild this entire global economy that we just spent the last 300 years creating. And that's going to require extraordinary amount of investment capital. Estimates are $100 to $150 trillion. Investing that capital is going to create for investors new risks, new opportunities. So the first reason I wrote the book is for investors, and for investors to understand those risks and opportunities, essentially for their own benefit. And then the second reason, as I said, is for the planet. The actions the investors take over the next 3 decades, they're going to change the planet. They're going to remake that global economy and reduce emissions to meet those science-based targets. And how they go about doing that, how quickly that capital is invested, and how effectively it's invested is going to make all the difference in terms of allowing us to avoid catastrophic climate change. The reality is that capital exists, but mobilizing that capital, investing it, is a pretty significant challenge. So my hope in writing the book, and it's actually how I conclude the book, is that every investor, and that's whether it's individual investors, institutional investors, every investor will understand these changes that are coming and act for their benefit, and ultimately in doing so for the benefit of all. That's not to say it's easy to solve. It's really complex. It's challenging. There's a lot of parts to it. But in the context of many of the other great challenges that society faces, this one, we actually have at hand the ability to solve it. And that frustrates me because I can see the solutions. I know what we need to do, and it's not because I know more than anyone else. Those pieces are well understood today. We just need to go do it. And so in writing this book, I really do hope that investors and business leaders, and ultimately everyone, gets on board with that, because of all the great problems we face, it would be nice to get this one solved. I began this field 20 years ago. And when I entered this field as a business person and as an investor, the challenge then wasn't the science of climate change. We understood very well, even 20 years ago, what the science is underlying climate change, what the challenge was, and what we need to do to address it. What was different 20 years ago was that there was very little that we could do about it. We had very few investment opportunities because most of the climate solutions that we need to reduce emissions were uncompetitive with existing products. You think about solar. Solar was 99 times more costly then than it is today. If we look at, say, electric vehicles, there was nothing that we could put on the highway. It's really just golf carts was about as far as you could go. Today, that situation completely changed. We have technologies and business models that already exist today to reduce more than half of global emissions. And those products are commercial and they are scalable already today. And then we actually already also have technologies to reduce the other half of the emissions we need to get down to zero. Those already exist, and they didn't exist a couple decades ago. They're not yet commercial, but they're under development, and many of them are already being financed by venture capitalists and other early stage investors. So we have this extraordinary change in the technologies and products that are available to us, what I call in the book climate solutions are available to us to reduce emissions, to get us to that net zero goal in the next 3 to 4 decades. But that's the largest trend. It's actually only one of four trends that have happened in the last couple of decades. The second trend is the rising physical risks of climate change. In other words, the reality of climate change is becoming apparent. Many of us are experiencing extreme heat waves, wildfires, floods, storms, and so on. And that's putting assets at risk, and we're starting to experience those losses today. The third big change is what I refer to as evolving social norms. Right? And we're seeing a lot of this is sort of an upswell from younger people who are much more concerned about climate change, probably because they're going to live to experience it, and they're pushing for action on it. And that's actually working its way through business world. You see companies taking action to reduce emissions, setting net zero targets, and many of that's because of pressure from younger consumers and employees to do something about the climate action. So you've got changing social norms. And then the last trend is government action on this. So go back to when I started this area a couple of decades ago. There was some government action. There was negotiations around international agreements, things like the Kyoto Protocol and the like. But what we've seen since then is government action flow from sort of top-down international agreements to very local action, often at the state level, even the municipal level. The challenge as an investor is knowing which companies, because when it comes to investing, you invest in companies or projects, will succeed in this new world and which ones will not. Let me give you two examples, right? If we look at the auto sector, I think it's pretty clear to say that the disruptor in this case has won, and the incumbents, at least to date, have not. If we look at, say, the incumbent in this case, General Motors, it was until pretty recently the world's largest automobile company. And you've got this upstart, this disruptor, Tesla, comes along just a little over a decade ago, and Tesla's now not just more valuable than GM, but it's by far the most valuable automobile company in the world today. So we see that story. And as an investor, of course, one would prefer to have, in that case, pick the disruptor. But this is not always the case. So if we look at another sector of the market, there was we look at the solar sector and the power industry. There was a disruptor called SunEdison. And I said was. I'm using the past tense because it went out of business. It grew very fast. It went public. It had a very high market cap. And it ultimately was driven out of business and went bankrupt. And the company that actually has become the most successful in that area is an incumbent, a sleepy little utility. It used to be called Florida Power and Light. It's now called NextEra. And it has grown to become the most valuable utility in America, in fact, the most valuable utility in the world, by moving slowly but surely and very aggressively into renewables. And so in this case, it's actually the incumbent who's a winner in this case. So for investors, understanding which sectors of the economy are, how they're going to change, and which companies are going to be successful as those changes manifest themselves, it's challenging. That's not an easy thing to be successful at. To invest successfully in the area of climate change, I would recommend that investors follow 5 different tactics. And the first of these is going to be pretty obvious to anyone who sort of thinks about this issue, but take the long view. Bill Gates famously said a number of years ago, we tend to overestimate the changes that are going to occur in the next 2 years, and we underestimate the changes that are going to occur in the next 10. And then, of course, he was talking about technology changes. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a lot of parallels between what's happening in technology and what's happening in climate change. So you need to take the long view. The second recommendation I would have is beware of greenwashing. A lot of companies are greenwashing and will greenwash. They are making promises that they cannot meet or do not intend to meet. And in some cases, they're doing this with the best of intentions. They wish to have these changes occur. I think everybody wants to address climate change. But greenwashing is a risk, and you need to be aware of it and avoid it, because in the end, that's unsuccessful. The third recommendation is a term I learned years ago when I worked as a trader in finance, and that term is the trend is your friend. Simple one and easy to remember, but it's very powerful. It's very powerful in investing advice. And here we see a number of trends that are all pushing in the same direction, and being aware of what those are will really help you over the long run as you invest. So be aware of those trends and use those to your advantage. The fourth recommendation I would make is to avoid businesses that anticipate a change in human behavior. So one of the things I write about in the book, even though it's a book about investing, is the challenges that we have as humans changing the way we invest and the way we build our economies. Our human behavior is very set we're very set in our ways, and very few businesses have successfully really changed our human behavior. In fact, the ones that are most successful are those who look at what we're doing and essentially improve upon the products that we enjoy. A good example of that would be, say, Beyond Meat, which I write about in the book. Beyond Meat does not try to say to people you shouldn't eat meat. It's saying we've got a product for you that tastes an awful lot like meat. You like it as a meat eater. You're really going to enjoy it, but it's much lower emissions. So that's my fourth advice. Avoid trying to change human behavior. It's too hard. And the last advice, which is similar to the first one, is it's better to act early than late. There's an economist, his name's Minsky, he passed away some years ago. And he became known for something called the Minsky moment. And the Minsky moment occurs when investors suddenly, all at the same time, reprice an asset class, right? And we experienced the Minsky moment back in the financial crisis of 2008, when suddenly investors all across the board suddenly repriced certain groups of assets, like subprime loans. Well, you want to avoid a Minsky moment in climate change. So far, asset values have moved relatively gradually in most sectors, but there may be a very rapid repricing of certain asset classes, real estate at risk and certain technologies at risk. Better to act early than late with those. So those are the recommendations I have for investors in this space. As an academic and a teacher, and from my investment and business experience, we tend to focus on individual technologies or individual sectors of the economy or individual businesses. And we get very deep in understanding what is happening in that sector and what are the opportunities and the risks that are there. And what I found in researching for the book was the connections between these sectors are really important. In fact, I ended up devoting an entire chapter I call Better Together. And what that chapter addresses is how these climate solutions, renewable energy, electric vehicles, energy storage, green hydrogen, and carbon removal, these are very separate industries, but in fact, they're very closely connected. And more importantly, as we see growth in one sector, as we see growth in renewable solar and wind, as we see growth in electric vehicles and so on, they have serious ramifications for these other sectors. In fact, they sort of turbocharge growth in the other sectors for both technology reasons and having to do with capital and how these sectors work together. And that's really important because ultimately we have to move all this in the same direction. And so the fact that these different sectors of the economy are actually working better together, not just separately, was actually new to me. And I thought really important conclusion. I'm often asked that question, especially by my students here at Columbia Business School. Right? Will we avoid catastrophic climate change? And my answer is we can avoid catastrophic climate change, but that doesn't mean we will avoid. Right? The difference being we have the tools to do so. We have the capital to do so. The capital exists. But we may not have the will to do so. And the real challenge there is the political will to do so, and particularly around the need for countries to cooperate in addressing this issue. The climate scientists have modeled it out many scenarios for us to address this. What are the different ways we can avoid catastrophic climate change? And then they assign sort of names to these scenarios. And the ones that are sort of best known are four scenarios that they model out. And the first of those scenarios is starting today, this year, we dramatically reduce emissions. And we do that every year for the next 30 years. And we just drive it to zero. And that is likely the cheapest, most effective, lowest risk way of solving this problem. I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to spend more time than it takes to get our act together. We're going to be very slow to do it. But there are other ways of reducing emissions ultimately, including what we call carbon removal from the atmosphere. It's more costly, but it is feasible. And that's ultimately what we'll probably end up doing because we'll be a little slow to get there. So, yes, I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic. And the realistic side of me says this is going to be a costly process and not well executed overall.